I walked into my ex's wedding with a barefoot corn seller named Kemi. People laughed. Whispered. They thought she was a server. But when she held that mic, she didn't toast to love. She spoke like poetry, calm, elegant. And then she burned the whole room with the truth. The bride froze. The groom broke. And the crowd? Silent. You think weddings are full of joy? This one was full of secrets. This is the toast nobody expected. One day, Uche came to a big, pretty wedding. He wore a nice shirt and pants. But he looked a little sad. With him was Kemi. She had no shoes. She wore a long skirt and had black marks on her hands from cooking corn. She smiled and walked slowly. People at the wedding were eating and laughing. The music was playing. The bride looked very happy. But when Uche and Kemi walked in, everything got quiet. Some people looked at Kemi and whispered. Who is she? One person said. She sells corn on the road, another person said. But Uche and Kemi just kept walking. A man at the wedding saw Kemi and thought she worked there. You're late, he said. Hold this tray and give people drinks. Kemi didn't get angry. She smiled and held the tray. Uche wanted to help her, but Kemi shook her head. She was okay. Kemi walked around and gave drinks to people. She listened as they talked. That's Uche, someone said. His girlfriend left him. Now she's marrying someone better. Kemi didn't say anything. She just listened. Later, the man with the microphone said, Does anyone want to say something nice to the bride and groom? No one said anything. Then Kemi stepped forward. Kemi stood in front of everyone. She was calm. She held her drink and said, To the bride. People smiled. They thought she was going to say something sweet. Then she said, The bride said she loved Uche. But she didn't wait for him. People stopped smiling. The bride told Uche she missed him. But she was with his best friend. Now everyone was quiet. Kemi looked at the bride. Good job, she said. I hope your lies don't make you sad one day. The bride looked shocked. The groom didn't know what to say. Uche didn't speak. He just looked at the groom. Because this was only the beginning. After Kemi spoke, the room got very quiet. No one laughed. No one clapped. Even the music stopped playing. The bride looked angry. The groom looked worried. A lady in a blue dress whispered, What is going on? Kemi gave the microphone back and walked to her seat. She was calm. Like she didn't say anything big. She took a sip from her glass and sat beside Uche. Uche didn't say anything. He just looked at the bride. The bride looked away. Someone finally turned the music back on. But the party didn't feel the same anymore. The bride stood up. She tried to smile, but her hands were shaking. Thank you for the toast, she said. That woman is confused. She doesn't know what she's talking about. But some people weren't sure. Is it true? One guest whispered to another. Did she really lie to Uche? Someone asked. The groom looked at the bride. Who is she talking about? He asked quietly. The bride said, She's no one. Just a girl from the street. But the groom was not happy. He had questions now. He didn't like lies. The bride started to feel scared. After the toast, the groom walked away from the table. He took out his phone and called someone. I need to know, he said. Was my wife with Uche's best friend? The person on the phone didn't talk for a moment. Then he said, Yes. It happened last year. She said it was a mistake. The groom closed his eyes. He felt angry. He had married someone who lied. Back at the wedding, Kemi sat quietly. She ate a small piece of cake. Uche didn't touch his food. The bride walked over. Her voice was low and sharp. You think you're smart, she said to Kemi. Kemi looked up and said, no. I just don't like lies. The bride stared at her. Kemi smiled again. After Kemi spoke to the bride, people started talking again. Why did Uche even come? One guest asked. He brought a corn cellar, another said, laughing. But some people weren't laughing. One woman at the next table said, Kemi was brave. She told the truth. The bride sat down next to the groom. She was trying to smile, but her face looked tight. The groom didn't hold her hand. He kept looking across the room, at Uche. The bride leaned close and whispered, forget what she said. It doesn't matter. But the groom didn't answer. Later, the groom went behind the building to make another call. This time, he called Uche's old best friend, the one Kemi spoke about. Did you and my wife ever do anything together? He asked. The man on the phone didn't know what to say. He waited a long time, then said, only once. A mistake. It meant nothing. The groom's face changed. He didn't say goodbye. He just ended the call. He didn't go back to the party right away. He just stood there. Alone. Angry. Sad. Back at the wedding, Uche hadn't said a single word. He sat quietly next to Kemi. He watched everything, but didn't join in. A little boy ran past their table. He dropped a toy. Kemi picked it up and gave it back with a kind smile. Some people looked at Uche and whispered, he came to cause problems. But Uche just sat there. Kemi leaned in and said softly, you don't have to fight. The truth is already loud. Uche nodded. He didn't need to yell. The truth had already done its job. But the night was not over yet. Not even close. After Kemi's toast, and after the phone calls, the groom came back to the wedding. But he didn't smile. He didn't sit with the bride. He walked past her and sat at a different table, alone. The bride stood up and followed him. Why are you acting like this? She asked. It's our wedding. The groom looked at her slowly. You told me you loved me, he said. But you were with someone else. The bride's eyes went wide. That's not true, she said quickly. They're lying. That girl, Kemi. She just wants to ruin everything. But the groom shook his head. I believe her, he said. Then he stood up and walked out of the party again. The bride sat down and held her face in her hands. People were watching. Some felt sorry. Some were just shocked. But no one clapped anymore. Guests started whispering again. Did you see the photo? Is that really her and Uche's friend? Who gave them that box? The bride was sweating now. Her makeup was starting to melt. She stood up and clapped her hands. Everyone. Let's dance, she said, trying to sound happy. But no one moved. Some people looked at her with sad eyes. Others looked angry. One woman said, you smiled and danced like everything was perfect. But now we see. The bride sat down again. She didn't know what to do. The truth was growing bigger than her lies. It was time for the bride and groom's first dance. The music started. The lights turned soft. But the groom didn't come to the dance floor. He was standing at the back, looking at Uche. Then he did something no one expected. He walked over to Uche's table. He stood in front of him and said, did you know? Uche looked at him. Quiet. Calm. Yes, he said. The groom nodded. He looked like he wanted to cry, but didn't. Then he turned to Kemi and said, thank you. You were brave. He didn't go back to the bride. He left the room. The music kept playing. But the dance never happened. After the groom left the room, everyone was quiet again. The bride looked around. She didn't know what to do. Then Kemi stood up. Some people turned to look at her. Others looked away. They didn't know what she would say next. Kemi didn't raise her voice. She just spoke kindly. I didn't come to hurt anyone, she said. I came because Uche deserved to hear the truth. And so did the groom. She looked at the bride. I don't hate you, Kemi said softly. I just couldn't let you lie your way into a happy life built on someone else's pain. The bride said nothing. Kemi sat down again. Now the guests started to talk, not just in whispers. Some clapped for Kemi. She did the right thing, one man said. She told the truth. That takes courage, a woman nodded. But others didn't agree. She ruined the wedding, someone said. She embarrassed the bride, another added. People started arguing at the tables. The happy party was no longer happy. The music stopped again. The cake still sat on the table, untouched. The gifts were still wrapped. But no one cared anymore. The wedding was broken. And no one knew how to fix it. Finally, Uche stood up. Everyone turned. He had not said a word the whole time. His voice was calm. Clear. I didn't come here to make a scene, he said. I came because I wanted to move on. He looked at the bride. You told me to wait. You said you needed time. I gave you that. I trusted you. He looked down for a moment, then back up. And now I see that your time was already taken by someone else. The bride tried to speak, but Uche raised his hand gently. It's okay, he said. You don't owe me anything now. I just needed to hear the truth, and I did. Then he looked at Kemi and smiled. For the first time in a long time. I feel free. After Uche spoke, the bride started to cry. Tears rolled down her face. Her makeup smudged. She wasn't angry now. She looked small. Like a balloon with no air left. A woman walked over and put a hand on her shoulder. Are you okay? She asked. The bride didn't answer. She just kept wiping her eyes. The music was still off. The dance floor was still empty. The chairs were messy, and plates of food were left untouched. This was supposed to be the happiest day of her life. But it didn't feel happy anymore. Kemi stood up quietly and walked out of the wedding hall. She didn't say anything. She didn't want more eyes on her. She stepped outside and sat on a bench near the garden. The wind blew gently. She looked up at the sky. For a moment, everything felt peaceful. Then Uche came out too. He sat beside her. Are you okay? He asked. Kemi nodded. Are you? Uche smiled a little. Better than I thought I'd be. They sat in silence for a while. It wasn't awkward. It felt calm. Back inside, the bride was on her phone. She was calling Uche's best friend. You said no one would ever find out, she whispered. The man on the phone said, I didn't tell anyone. The bride was shaking now, not from sadness, but fear. Do you think the groom will leave me? She asked. The man didn't answer. Then, someone walked past her table, a woman with a camera. She was from a gossip blog. She had recorded Kemi's speech. And she was already uploading the video online. The toast nobody expected was about to go viral. The woman with the camera smiled as she typed on her phone. She uploaded the video and added a title. Wedding guest exposes bride's secret in front of everyone. In just 5 minutes, the video started to spread. People were watching it on their phones, even while sitting at the wedding. Oh my goodness, this is crazy, someone said. Who is this barefoot lady? Another asked. People outside the wedding were now talking too. Strangers were sharing it. Commenting. Laughing. Arguing. The bride had no idea yet. But her secret was no longer a secret. The bride's cousin walked up to her, holding her phone. Look, she said, showing her the video. The bride watched herself smiling. Then Kemi's voice came in. To the bride, who kissed his best friend. The bride covered her mouth. "It's already online," she whispered. She grabbed her phone and saw it for herself. People were tagging her name, commenting mean things, sending laughing emojis. "No, no, no," she whispered. "This can't happen." But it was happening. And she couldn't stop it. Just then, the groom came back. He walked slowly, looking around at the crowd. People were watching him now, wondering what he would do. He went straight to the front and took the microphone. His voice was quiet but strong. "I didn't plan to speak again," he said. "But now the whole world is watching. So I will." The bride looked scared. The guests leaned in. "I trusted someone with my heart," the groom said. "But trust means nothing without truth." Then he looked at the bride. "I don't know if I can forgive you." "Not today." Gasps. Tears. And silence again. After the groom spoke, the bride sat very still. Her eyes were full of tears. Then her mother stood up. She looked around the room, angry. She pointed at Kemi, even though Kemi was still outside. "This girl came here to destroy my daughter's big day," she shouted. Some people nodded. Others looked down. "She is a corn seller. She doesn't belong here." But someone else stood up. It was Uche's aunt. She said loudly, "Your daughter destroyed her own day. Not Kemi." Now more people were standing, talking, arguing. The wedding had turned into a war of words. While people were arguing inside, Kemi and Uche were still outside. Uche looked at his phone and saw the video. "It's everywhere," he said. Kemi looked worried. "Did I make things worse?" "No," Uche said. "You told the truth. That matters." Then they heard shouting. Voices from inside. Uche and Kemi stood up and walked back into the room. Everyone turned to look at them. It was like a movie. Kemi held her head high. Her feet were still bare. Her dress was still simple. But she walked like a queen. The bride's mother pointed again. "You think you're better than us?" she asked Kemi. "What do you even have?" Kemi looked at her calmly. "I have peace," she said. "I don't lie. I don't cheat. And I didn't come to break anything. I came to speak what many were afraid to say." The bride's mother scoffed. "You sell corn by the road." Kemi smiled. "Yes. And I still walked into this room with more truth than all your gold." Some guests clapped. Others just watched, silent. Then someone shouted from the back. "Maybe Kemi should have been the bride." The room was quiet again after someone shouted, "Maybe Kemi should have been the bride." The bride looked shocked. The groom looked down. Then the groom's mother stood up. She was quiet, calm, and well-dressed. She looked at the bride, then at her son. "My son was raised to be kind, honest, and loyal," she said. "But today, he was lied to. In front of everyone." She turned to the bride. "You may have worn the dress. But you weren't ready to be a wife." The bride's eyes filled with tears again. And the guests stayed silent. Just when things couldn't get worse, someone walked through the door. It was Uche's old best friend. The one who had been with the bride behind Uche's back. Everyone turned. Some people gasped. Some shook their heads. The groom clenched his fists. The friend raised his hands. "I didn't come to fight," he said. "I just want to say something." The groom said, "You already said enough, with your actions." The friend looked sad. "I messed up. I hurt Uche. And now I hurt you too." Then he looked at the bride. "And I was never worth it." While everyone was focused on the friend, someone in the crowd said, "We know Kemi sells corn, but what else do we really know about her?" People turned again. Kemi looked calm. Uche stood beside her. Kemi took a deep breath. "I wasn't always strong," she said. I used to beg for food. I slept on the street once. People laughed at me. She looked at the bride. But I never lied to rise. I never stepped on anyone to stand tall. Then she looked at the crowd. I sell corn, yes. But I carry something gold inside me, truth. Some people clapped softly. Others were starting to look at Kemi with new eyes. After Kemi finished speaking, a tall man stood up. He wore glasses and a fine suit. No one knew him well, but he had been watching everything. He cleared his throat and said, "My name is Mr. Duro. I own a small radio station." Everyone turned to listen. He looked at Kemi. "I recorded your speech," he said. "It was powerful. Real. Brave." Kemi looked surprised. "I want to offer you a job," Mr. Duro said. "Come speak on my station. People need to hear someone like you." The room gasped again. The corn seller was being asked to speak on the radio. The bride couldn't take it anymore. She stood up fast. Her chair fell over. "Why is everyone acting like she's perfect?" she shouted. "She walked in here with no shoes. She embarrassed me." No one clapped. No one cheered. The bride looked around and saw that even her friends were quiet now. One of them finally said, "You didn't just lose your groom. You lost our respect too." The bride started crying again. But this time, no one came to hug her. She had all the decorations, the dress, the money. But she stood alone. Uche looked around the room. So much had happened in just a few hours. Lies had been told. Truth had been spoken. People had changed. He turned to Kemi. "You stood beside me when I had nothing," he said. "You stood beside me today, when the world was watching." Kemi looked at him, eyes soft. "You told the truth when it was hard," he said. "You walked in here with no shoes, but all the strength in the world." Then he said the words no one expected to hear that day. "Will you build a new life with me?" Kemi smiled. But she didn't say yes. Not yet. Kemi looked at Uche. Her heart was full. But she didn't smile just yet. "Uche," she said gently. "You were broken not long ago. Are you ready to build something new?" Uche nodded. "I am. With you." Kemi looked around the room. People were still staring, waiting to hear her answer. She took a deep breath. "I care about you," she said. "But love is not just about big words. It's about steady steps." Uche looked confused for a second. Then Kemi said, "Let's walk together. Slowly. No rush. No noise. Just truth." And that was better than a yes. From the back of the room, the bride's father stood up. He had been quiet the whole time. His face looked tired. His eyes looked sad. He walked to the front and stood beside his daughter. Then he turned to everyone and said, "I taught my daughter to be strong. But I didn't teach her to be honest." He placed his hand on her shoulder. "I'm sorry to the groom, and to his family." Then he looked at Kemi. "Today, you came in with no shoes. But you left footprints on all our hearts." The bride looked at the floor. She had nothing to say. The wedding was over now. The chairs were empty. The food was cold. The flowers looked tired. Guests were leaving in small groups, still talking about everything they saw. Some took pictures with Kemi. Some shook her hand. As the night sky grew darker, Uche and Kemi walked to the gate together. No music. No dancing. No wedding cake. But something better had happened. Truth came in, wearing no shoes, and still stood taller than all the lies. Kemi looked at Uche and said, "Let's go home." And they walked off, side by side, into whatever came next. The sun came up, quiet and soft. Birds were singing, but Kemi barely heard them. She was sitting outside her small house, roasting corn like always. People walking past looked at her differently now. "That's the woman from the wedding," someone whispered. "She told the truth," another said. Some waved. Some smiled. One little girl said, "You're brave." Kemi smiled back. But inside her heart, things were not so quiet. She was thinking about Uche, the bride, the video, the job offer. Too many things were happening at once. Around noon, Kemi's phone rang. It was Mr. Duro, the man from the wedding who owned the radio station. "Good afternoon, Kemi," he said. "I wasn't joking about the job." Kemi held the phone tighter. "We want you to come speak," he said. "About truth, life, anything you care about. People are asking for you." Kemi blinked. "Me? On the radio?" "Yes," Mr. Duro replied. "You have something the world needs." Kemi didn't say yes right away. She looked down at her hands, burned and dark from firewood, but strong. Maybe, just maybe, her voice had a place in the world. Far across town, Uche was sitting in his small living room. Two men knocked on his door. They wore matching shirts and had serious faces. "Are you Mr. Uche?" one asked. "Yes," Uche replied slowly. "We're from a company that saw the wedding video," the other man said. "You've become interesting to the public." They handed Uche a card. "Someone wants to buy your story. Your side. For a TV show." Uche was quiet. He didn't want fame. He just wanted peace. But peace was becoming hard to find. That afternoon, Kemi heard a knock on her door. She wiped her hands and opened it. It was the bride. Her hair was messy. Her eyes were tired. She looked nothing like the woman in the fancy dress from yesterday. Kemi stepped aside without a word. The bride sat down on the bench. Quiet. Then she finally said, "Why did you do it?" Kemi looked at her. Calm. Still. "I didn't do it to shame you," Kemi said. "I did it because truth sets people free." The bride shook her head. "Well, now I'm not free. I'm alone." Kemi replied gently, "You were alone the moment you started lying." The next day, Kemi went to the radio station. She wore a clean wrapper. Still barefoot. Mr. Duro smiled. "Just speak from the heart," he said. She sat in front of a big microphone. Her voice shook at first. But then she began. "I sell corn. I live small. But I have seen what lies can do to people," she said. She told the story, not with hate, but with wisdom. She spoke about pain, and healing, and the beauty of telling the truth even when it hurts. When she finished, the phone lines lit up. People were calling in. Crying. Thanking her. Kemi had found her voice. And now, the world was listening. Back at his house, Uche got another visit. This time, it wasn't a job offer. It was a warning. 3 men in suits stood outside his door. One held up a phone with the wedding video paused on the screen. "You've hurt some powerful people," the man said. Uche frowned. "I told the truth." "Sometimes," the man said, "the truth costs too much." Then he handed Uche a note. "Stay quiet. Or you'll regret it." The man walked away. Uche stood in his doorway, holding the note. Trouble was coming. And this time, it wasn't just heartbreak. It was danger. That evening, after her radio show, Kemi returned home feeling tired but hopeful. She lit a small fire to roast corn. Then, another knock. She opened the door, and froze. A man stood there. Older. Dusty clothes. His eyes looked like hers. "Papa," she whispered. It was her father. The one who had left when she was a child. "I heard your voice on the radio," he said. "I didn't come back for food. I came back because I'm proud." Kemi's eyes filled with tears. She didn't know what to say. The girl who once begged on the street. had found her way home. Uche sat at his table, staring at the note the men gave him. He thought of Kemi's voice on the radio. How she didn't bend. How she didn't hide. He picked up his phone and called a reporter. "I'll talk," he said. "I won't hide my story." "Are you sure?" the reporter asked. "They might come after you." Uche took a breath. "They already tried. But I've lived through worse." That night, Uche wrote everything down, his heartbreak, the betrayal, the pain, and how truth walked in barefoot and changed everything. The next morning, his story was on every screen. Kemi sat in a small cafe, listening to the radio. They were replaying her voice. Uche's story was now trending online. Some people were angry. Some were inspired. Some said she was a hero. Others called her trouble. Kemi didn't try to explain herself anymore. She had roasted corn with smoke in her eyes, now she was roasting lies with fire in her voice. Uche walked in and sat beside her. He said, "They're watching us now." Kemi smiled. "Let them watch," she said. "Let them see what truth looks like when it doesn't wear shoes." They both looked out the window. A storm was coming. Watch out for part 2. But for now, they had each other.